Happy Blockheads Wednesday, everybody. We're all ready to week 8 of our second group for Blockheads 5. This week's guest designer is Crystal Manning, and she's designed the lovely sparkle block here for us. This block has a lot of fun elements in it, and I know we're going to see some really great variations and different takes on it with color and fabric, and I can't wait to see what y'all do with sparkle. This is my finished block, and I'm just pleased with how it turned out. I really love this design, and I had a lot of fun making it. I've got a fun ruler to show you guys that's going to help us trim down our 4-patch units here this week. So let's dive into the pattern and take a look at that ruler and start sewing. All right, we've got lots of pieces in our sparkle block today because we're going to be making 4-patch units, we're going to be making flying geese, and we're going to be making half square triangles. So let's take a look at the cutting instructions. I'll be making the 6-inch finished block, so I'm using these measurements for my cutting, and I'll be referring to these measurements probably when I'm going through this video. So just in case I forget to clarify that later, I'm talking about the 6-inch finished block in the sample that I'm making in this video. Okay, so we've got, for our smallest 4-patch units here, I've got the A and B blocks, and then this is the C unit for making the larger corner 4-patch units. And then I've got my larger D and smaller E units for the flying geese. We'll be doing the 4-at-a-time flying geese. And then I've got my F rectangles here. And then I've got the G, H, and I squares for my center half square triangles. Now, you see, I also have these strips over here, and that's because I'm going to show y'all how to make these smallest 4-patch units using strip piecing instead of using these little bitty squares. And the reason that I still wrote the pattern for the individual squares as opposed to strip piecing is that maybe if you're going really scrappy and you have just a very little bit of your favorite fabric left that you want to use here, you might not have enough to do strip piecing. So it's always nice to have a couple different ways in your back pocket of making a particular unit. So I will make a 4-patch unit using these small squares, and then I'll also make it using the strip piecing, and we can compare the difference between the two. I've got another great ruler to show you guys today. It's Deb Tucker's 4-patch square up ruler. So I'll use this to trim down my 4-patch units after I sew them using the strip piecing method. What's great about this ruler is it walks you through the sizes that you need to make your strips for your 4 patches. And then the side sections here are what you'll use to square up and trim down your 4 patches. So one side is for units that finish on a 1/2 inch, and then the other side is for units that finish on a whole inch. So we'll use this to trim down our 4-patch units when we're done sewing them together. So I'm making the 6-inch finished block, as I said, and then my small 4-patch units are going to finish at 1 inch, which means I'll trim them down to 1.5 inches. So for this method, Deb's ruler has you cut 1 1/4 inch strips. These rulers by Deb Tucker, all of her rulers, have you make oversized units that you trim down. And personally, that's a favorite of mine. I think that always makes for really perfect units. So she has you cut those strips just a little bit wide, and then your 4-patch units will be a little bit oversized, and we'll trim them down. So the first step in our block today is to make these smaller 4-patch checkerboard units. So I'm going to take my strips here, and I'm also going to take my individual squares that I've cut per the pattern cutting instructions. And I'm going to stitch those together using a scant 1/4 inch seam. So I like to layer the piece that I'm going to press towards on top. And so in this case, I'll be pressing towards the darker fabric. So I'm going to lay my darker fabric on top. And I don't know that there's any real reason to do that. It works for me. So it's purely anecdotal evidence that putting your fabric that you're going to press towards on top makes any difference. It's just my preference. And so I will sew along one edge using a scant 1/4 inch seam. And then with my squares here, I will just take the smaller square, and these are so tiny, and put the darker square on top of the larger square, and I'll chain piece those as well. All right, so let's start sewing together our small 4-patch units. A quick word about sewing with pieces this small. So I have cut these to 1 inch per the pattern instructions. And again, this is for the 6-inch block. So working with tiny little squares like this, I personally prefer to starch my fabrics. I starch my fabrics regardless, but I definitely would not want to work with pieces this small without the fabric being starched. It just makes it so crisp and easy to work with. It slows down the fraying, I have found anyway, and just makes it so much easier to get a really precise cut and seam when you start your fabrics in advance. Okay, I've sewn my strips together. I have pressed towards the darker fabric, and then I've layered my strips together, rotating the orientation of the strips, and nested that seam. And now I'm cutting segments the same width as the original strips. So I cut my original strips at 1 1/4 inches. So now I'm cutting segments here also at 1 1/4 inches. And I'm going to need 8 of them. So I'm going to cut 8 of these segments. And then I'll sew another 1/4 inch seam along the long edge. Okay, I've got my chained piece units here. They're ready to have these threads snipped. And then I'm going to press my seams. I'm going to press them open. I prefer to press my seams open in these situations. So I will press these open, and then we'll take a look at them and get them trimmed up. Okay, here are my finished 4-patch units. So this is the one that I made using Deb Tucker's method with the strip piecing. And this is the one that I made using the 4 individual squares from our pattern cutting instructions. So you can see there's a big difference between the two. So this one is oversized, as I mentioned, and we're going to trim it down. And then this one, let's take a look and see where it measures up. So I'm going to look to put this dot right here, right at my center point there. And I'm right at 1.5 inches, which is where it needs to be to finish at 1 inch. So not a lot of room for error in this method. So this is going to yield very precise results that you don't need to trim down or trim very little. And then these come in at a healthy just about 2 inches. Now I did use a scant 1/4 inch seam, so that makes a difference, but we're going to need to trim these down. We're going to have 1/2 inch pretty much that we're going to be trimming off of the sides. So let's take a look at that 4-patch square up ruler and see how we use it to trim down these oversized 4 patches. Okay, the instructions say to look for the desired finished size circle on the tool. So remember, one side of the tool is going to be for trimming down 4-patch units that are going to finish at a whole size. The other side is for trimming down units that are going to finish with a 1/2 inch size. So my units for my 6-inch block are going to finish at 1 inch. So there's my 1 inch mark, and this is the center point. This is going to be the center point of my 4-patch unit when I use this tool to trim down my unit. So I'm going to put that center circle right there where my seams meet, and then I'll be trimming down You can see about a 1/4 inch on each side. So I'm going to be looking for this 1.5 inch when I'm trimming, when I rotate my unit around after trimming it. So let's use my other little 4 patch here as an example. So you can see I've got that unit centered there, and it's just about right at the 1.5 inch mark. So I could trim just the tiniest little bit just to neaten up the edges. So let's trim down these units. Okay, I've got everything lined up. I've got that center circle for my finished size of my 4 patch unit right there where all my seams intersect. And now I'm going to trim along the right side and the top side. Okay, I'll line it up again. And I'll trim one more time on the right side and the top. And there we go, a perfectly precise little 1 inch finished 4 patch unit. So let me trim up the rest of my 4 patch units here, and then we'll be ready to move to the next step. What if you don't have Deb Tucker's 4 patch ruler and you have slightly oversized 4 patches that you want to trim down? Here's how to use a regular ruler to trim these down. So think about your finished size unit. So our finished size is going to be 1 inch. That means we're going to trim it down to 1.5 inches. Okay, so that means that each square should be 3/4 of an inch unfinished. Okay, so I'm going to look for this 3/4 inch mark on my ruler. So I'm counting 1/4 inches over and 1/4 inches down, and I've got the 3/4 inch mark right here, and that's going to be the center point of my unit. So I will trim based on that. Okay, I've got all my pretty little small 4 patch units made. Now it's time to make the larger 4 patch corner units using the C squares. So I'm going to make 4 of those units, and I will press my seams towards the C squares as I'm sewing the units together in pairs. And then I will probably press the little seam between the 2 pair units. I'll press this seam open. Okay, my corner 4 patch units are all done, and I trimmed them down to 2.5 inches. Well, I say that, I didn't really have to trim hardly anything at all. They came in right at 2.5 inches, so it's mostly just tidying up some loose threads on the ends here. So those are all done and ready to put away and move on to the next step, which is to make our flying geese. And we're using the no waste 4 at a time flying geese method. So we've been doing that method all along. So I'm going to do that here and come back after my flying geese are done. Okay, my 4 at a time no waste flying geese are done and ready to trim. I have to admit that I used to hate this method of making flying geese. It just never seemed to work for me. I always came out with flying geese units that were too small. So the trick is to have measurements that give you a little bit of breathing room so that you can trim down. And that's what I do. That's what we've done here in this pattern, is we give you slightly oversized units that you can then trim down. I go into detail on making these flying geese using the no waste method in some of my earlier Blockheads videos, so you can go back and watch those for a few more tips. But let's just talk real quick about trimming down these oversized units using your regular ruler. Okay, I want to trim my flying geese unit for the 6-inch block to 1.5 inches by 2.5 inches. So I'm going to find the 1.25 inch mark on my ruler, and I'm going to align that point right here at the tip of my flying geese where my 2 triangles meet. And then I can align the seam of this triangle with this line on the ruler. Okay, perfect. So now I can trim, and you see how much you have to trim away with the slightly oversized flying geese that you'll get with the cutting instructions in your Blockheads pattern. So I'll trim along here and then turn my unit around and trim again. This time I'll look for 1 1/4 inch along this side. Line that up. Okay, perfect. Now you see that I'm at 1 1/2 inches along this line and 2 1/2 inches this way. There's that 1 1/4 inch point right there where my triangles meet. And then I'm lined up nicely along this diagonal line on my ruler. And so now I'll trim the rest away. And now I have a perfectly trimmed flying geese unit. All right, let me trim the rest of my flying geese and then we'll be ready for the next step. Okay, my flying geese are all trimmed up and now I'm ready to sew these F rectangles to my flying geese units. So when I do that, I'm going to sew with the flying geese unit on top so that I can make sure that I don't lose my point. I like to be able to see the point of the flying geese as I'm sewing it. If I sew on this side, I'm blind to where my point is. So I'm going to sew with the flying geese up, and then I'm probably going to, I'm either going to press the seam towards the F rectangle or I'm going to press the seam open. I haven't quite decided yet. Okay, I ended up pressing towards the F rectangle. So my little flying geese and rectangle units are done and ready to set aside. And now I'll move on to making the center half square triangles. These are going to go here. So I'm using this gold print is going to be like the corner units. And then the orange and the green here are going to be the kind of alternating units in this center square. So again, we're going to do the 2 at a time method. You can put a draw a line from corner to corner on the back of your squares if you want, and sew a 1/4 inch on either side, or you can use seam tape, whichever method works for you. I'm going to press my seams towards the gold print on all of my HSTs. At this point, it doesn't matter which way I press, in the sense that I'm not going to be nesting those particular seams, so I'm going to press all of them towards the gold print. Okay, I've got my little half square triangle units finished and trimmed. They are trimmed to 1 1/2 inches for this 6-inch block. And now it's time to join them together in this unit that's going to be our center unit for the block. When I sew the 2 half square triangles together, I'm going to press towards the green print for these so that my seams will nest. Okay, my center unit is done and trimmed to 2 1/2 inches for the 6-inch block. So now I'm ready to assemble my whole block, and I'm not sure yet how I'm going to press my seams. I think normally when I am sewing my blocks together, I press the corner units out and then press in towards the center unit. But I feel like I might end up pressing my seams open. I'm not sure. I'm just going to have to see how the fabric feels when I get it to the ironing board. So let me assemble my block, and then I'll come back and tell you how I did the pressing. Well, here's my finished sparkle block. I really think it sparkles. I love it. It turned out super cute. I did a couple different things with the pressing. I pressed on my top and bottom rows, these seams I pressed open. And then for my center row, I pressed towards the solid fabric rectangle here. So a couple different ways of pressing, and then I always press my row seams open. So I love how this turned out, and I got my Americana version done as well. I did something a little bit different on the pressing with the checkerboard for patches here. I spun those seams. I have never really done that. I know a lot of people like to spin their seams, and I wanted to see if it made any kind of difference. And actually, I think I like pressing the seams open better. I feel like this looks a little bit chunky or something. It doesn't look quite as flat to me as these little 4 patches do. So that's just my hot take on it. I probably wouldn't bother spinning the seams if I could do this one over again. But it was good to try it out and see how it turned out. Thank you, Crystal, for designing this gorgeous sparkle block. I think this is such a fun block, and I can't wait to see everyone's take on the sparkle block. So don't forget to join us on Facebook and our official Blockheads Facebook group, and be sure to post your pictures there, and then also post them on Instagram using the hashtag ModaBlockheads5. Thanks so much for joining us this week. I hope you've enjoyed this week's video, and happy quilting, and we'll see you next time.